Wait, let me ask you a question. Did you choose to be born Korean? Of course not. You were just born, right here on this land. But that whole just being born here thing, it actually means you were born carrying a massive geopolitical weight on your shoulders. The country you are born into completely dictates the terrain you have to survive on. And from day one, that terrain narrows down your country's choices. That's our story today. The story of the ground right beneath our feet. Minus, let's pull up the map. The Korean Peninsula. If you ask a foreigner looking at the Korean Peninsula for the first time what it looks like, they usually say the same things. It looks like a rabbit, a tiger, something hanging downward. But geopoliticians, they see it entirely differently. To them, the peninsula looks like a pair of pincers jutting out from the continent straight into the ocean. Or you could look at it this way, like a finger extending from the mainland, pointing into the sea. And right at the very tip of that finger is where we live. Peninsula? In Hanja, it literally translates to half island, surrounded by water on three sides, tethered to the mainland by only one. Geopolitically, a peninsula is an incredibly unique position. It is both an absolute blessing and a total curse. You can reach out into the ocean. You can become a maritime power. You can trade. You're connected to the continent, but at the exact same time. It's the exact point of impact where maritime powers and continental powers collide. When those two massive forces clash, the peninsula automatically becomes the battlefield. Look at history, and you'll see just how much suffering lands born as peninsulas have had to endure. The Italian peninsula, invaded and ruled by foreign powers for thousands of years. They didn't even get a unified kingdom of Italy until 1861. Before that, it was endlessly torn apart. The Balkan Peninsula, literally known as the powder keg of Europe. The spark that ignited World War I was struck right there, even in the 1992. It became a bloodbath of civil war. And then, there's the Korean Peninsula, invaded by foreign powers for millennia. The Tang Dynasty, the Mongols, Japanese pirates, the Bbali-bbali War, the Qing invasions, the Japanese colonial period, and the Korean War. This didn't happen because the Korean people were inherently weak. It is the brutal destiny forged entirely by the geography of a peninsula. Minus, let's go a little deeper. Look to the north of the peninsula, and you have China. A continental superpower with the largest population in the world. Look east, and you have Japan, a maritime superpower. Look northeast, and you have Russia, the country with the largest landmass on Earth. And just beyond that, across the Pacific, the United States. The Korean Peninsula is its dead center among these four nations. Dead center. Is there any other country on the face of the Earth so perfectly, seamlessly surrounded by absolute superpowers? Russia is massive, so they border a lot of countries. The US basically just has Canada and Mexico, relatively weak neighbors. China borders some strong nations, but China itself is so enormous that it has breathing room. But Korea, a tiny nation, wedged directly between the strongest countries in the world. That is the original sin of the Korean Peninsula, the geopolitical baggage it was born carrying. Minus, let's look at history, back to the Joseon dynasty. From its very founding, Joseon chose the diplomacy of Sadai, serving the great. It was a foreign policy strategy of submitting to the Ming dynasty as the greater nation. A lot of people look back at this as a humiliating policy, a choice totally lacking pride. But from a geopolitical standpoint, it was an incredibly rational survival tactic. How does a small country survive right next to a massive empire? Fighting and winning is physically impossible. Acting completely independently just puts a massive target on your back. So you piggyback on a superpower and survive under its umbrella. Sadai diplomacy wasn't humiliation. It was a survival strategy. And right at the foundation of that strategy is the peninsula. If there had been a massive mountain range things might have been different. If mountains as high as the Himalayas block the north, Jose might have made different choices. But the northern border is just the Yanu and Tumen rivers. Rivers freeze in the winter, and when they freeze, armies can just walk right across them. The Korean Peninsula's northern defense line literally disappears every single winter. That vulnerability is exactly what dictated this land's diplomatic strategy for thousands of years. Let's jump to 1894. The Sino-Japanese War. Do you know where Japan and the Qing dynasty fought? On the Korean Peninsula. They fought over the Korean Peninsula, right on top of Korean soil. Two foreign nations waging war in our backyard. The Qing dynasty lost. Japan won. 10 years later, in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War breaks out. And where do they fight? Once again, Korea and Manchuria. Russia and Japan fighting over who gets to control the peninsula. Japan won again, and in 1910, Japan swallowed the Korean Peninsula whole. Throughout this entire process, Joseon got to decide almost nothing. The great powers treated the peninsula like a pawn on a chessboard. Has there ever been a more naked display of the tragedy of a buffer state? We talked about Ukraine in part 1. A buffer's owns and wished between great powers. A land whose destiny is dictated not by its own will, but by its coordinates. If Ukraine is the European version of Korea, Korea is the East Asian version of Ukraine. The terrain is different, but the logic is exactly the same. -1. Imperial Japan falls. Liberation. The land was finally ours again, but before the joy of liberation could even settle, the great powers rolled right back in. The Soviets marched into the north, and the Americans into the south. They sliced the peninsula in half right along the 38th parallel. Why the 38th parallel? Was it a line that carefully considered Korea's history or terrain? Nope. To low-level US State Department officials were looking at a map late at night, and they just drew a line roughly across the middle. It took them 30 minutes. One of those two men was Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State. 30 minutes. That 30-minute decision created a division that is still tearing the peninsula apart today. Remember the African borders from Part 3, how straight lines drawn with rulers by Europeans basically booked a century of conflict. The 38th parallel is the exact same story. One arbitrary line drawn by superpowers fractured the destinies of tens of millions of people. The Korean War exploded right over that line. They fought for 3 years, millions died, and the war never actually ended. We are still in an armistice. It's a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Right at this very moment, we are living on top of an unfinished war. Minus all right. Let's fast forward to the modern day. 2016. The South Korean government decides to deploy the HAAD. Do you know what the HAAD is? It's a terminal high-altitude area defense system. If North Korea launches a missile, this system shoots it down out of the sky. From South Korea's perspective, this is strictly defensive. It's about protecting themselves from North Korean nukes. But China completely lost its mind. Why? Because TADA doesn't just look at North Korea. It can peer deep into mainland China. Beijing argued activities would be completely exposed to the US. China demanded Seoul withdraw the deployment. When South Korea refused, China slapped them with massive economic retaliation. The Lot Group was practically forced out of China. Chinese tour groups to Korea were banned. K-pop and K-dramas were blocked. Unofficial sanctions battered Korean exports. The economic damage was in the tens of billions of dollars. All South Korea did was bring in a single defensive missile system, and they got economically pummeled for it. How is something like this even possible? China is South Korea's largest trading partner. Roughly 25% of all Korean exports go to China. If Beijing decides to flip a switch, they can inflict devastating damage on the Korean economy. security tied to the US economy tied to China. South Korea is deeply, inextricably tethered to both superpowers at the exact same time, and when those two giants start bumping heads, Korea is constantly, relentlessly forced to choose sides. TAAD was just the most explosive version of that choice. Let's look at this even more coldly. Do you know why South Korea is so crucial to the United States? South Korea is the absolute name of America's East Asian defense line. There are 28,000 US troops stationed there. And that military presence isn't just there to stop North Korea. It is a forward operating base to keep China in check. It's a barricade to block continental powers, including Russia, from spilling out into the Pacific. The US doesn't protect South Korea just out of the goodness of its heart. They do it because Korea's location is absolutely vital to America's entire Pacific strategy. What happens if the Korean Peninsula falls into the hands of China or a hostile power? Japan is immediately threatened. A massive hole gets ripped right through America's Pacific defense line. That's why America can never abandon Korea. But at the same time, they don't really love it when Korea acts too independently. Either they need Korea to be a predictable, reliable piece on their strategic chessboard. Now look at why Korea is so important to China. As long as the peninsula is locked in a US alliance, the American military is sitting right on China's doorstep. To Beijing, that is incredibly uncomfortable. If Korea were neutral approach China, that discomfort completely vanishes. So China constantly pressures Seoul, trying to make sure they don't lean too heavily into Washington's arms. South Korea is literally being yanked by the US and China at the exact same time. South Korea isn't the player in this tug of war. It is the row. And we absolutely cannot leave out North Korea. A lot of people explain North Korea purely through the madness of the Kim family. And they're not wrong. The regime is undeniably abnormal. But if you look at why North Korea refuses to give up its nukes through the lens of geography, you start to see something else entirely. Put yourself in Pyongyang's shoes for a second. To the east is Japan, an American ally. To the south is South Korea, packed with US troops. Across the Yellow Sea is China. Sure, they're an ally, but North Korea can't fully trust them. Beijing would throw Pyongyang under the bus the second it served their own interests. And look at recent history. Saddam Hussein in Iraq gave up his nuclear ambitions and he died. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya gave up his nuclear program and he died. The North Korean leadership watched those exact scenes play out in high definition. A dictator who gives up their nukes dies. That is the brutal lesson North Korea learned. So North Korea's nuclear arsenal isn't just a simple threat or a blackmail card. It is a desperate survival strategy forged by geographical vulnerability and historical observation. Now you kind of understand why this problem is so impossibly hard to solve, right? Let's pause for a second and talk about our everyday life. Have you ever wondered why South Korea's zeal for education is so intensely high? Why Koreans work so incredibly hard? Why we developed the Bbali-bbali hurry culture? There are plenty of reasons. But there is no denying that massive geopolitical pressure has literally been carved into the national psyche, constantly surrounded by superpowers, constantly having to fight tooth and nail just to survive. The land is small, so we had to invest in people. There are natural resources, so we had to survive purely on brainpower. The geography of the peninsula literally forged the character of our people. And do you know what that character ended up creating? The miracle on the Han River. Semiconductors, K-pop, K-dramas. We went from the ashes of a devastating war to a top 10 global economic powerhouse in just 16 years. How was this even possible? That suffocating geopolitical pressure paradoxically became rocket fuel. The absolute desperation to survive became the engine for hyper-innovation. The purse of the peninsula simultaneously became its greatest blessing. Let's talk a bit more about K-pop. BTS, BLAC, KPINK, New Jeans. The whole world is going crazy for them. But not a lot of people have tried reading the global success of K-pop through a geopolitical lens. Geographically, Korea isn't the US, it isn't China, and it isn't Japan. It doesn't entirely belong to any single dominant cultural sphere. Ambiguity, paradoxically, became its greatest weapon. K-pop took the slickness of American pop, the intricate structure of Japanese idol culture, and blended it with a uniquely Korean soul, because it doesn't entirely belong to any one side. Anyone in the world can listen to it and feel like it's theirs. The cultural hybridization created by a peninsula is one of the secret ingredients that made K-pop a global phenomenon. The terrain created the culture, and now that culture is moving the world, not with diplomacy, not with military might, but with culture. Minus, all right. Coming back to the present, let me ask you a brutally cold question. With the US-China rivalry getting worse by the day, what exactly is South Korea supposed to do? I'll be perfectly honest with you. There is no right answer. If we fully side with the US, China launches economic retaliation, just like THAAD. Or maybe even worse. If we fully side with China, America pulls its security umbrella. US troops may pull out, leaving us standing completely alone in front of North Korean nukes. That is exactly why South Korea has maintained strategic ambiguity, a strategy of trying not to lean entirely to one side while desperately keeping the peace with both. But as the US-China clash intensifies, that grey area is shrinking rapidly. Both superpowers are demanding a much clearer choice. How South Korea navigates this suffocating pressure is going to be the single most difficult diplomatic homework we face for the next few decades. And the starting point of that homework is always exactly the same. The geography of the peninsula. Minus, let's wrap this up. We didn't choose this land, but this land made us who we are. Surviving thousands of years of foreign invasions taught us how to convert sheer desperation into momentum. Walking a tightrope between superpowers honed our diplomacy into a literal lot form. Fighting to survive on a rock with zero natural resources forced us to create a culture that invests in human capital. The peninsula is vulnerable, but being vulnerable doesn't mean you are weak. Because we were vulnerable, we had to be smarter. We had to be faster. We had to be more creative. Bbali-bbali isn't just a personality trait. It is an instinct literally carved into our DNA by the terrain, just so we could survive. The miracle on the Han River wasn't just magic. It was the inevitable result created by people who had been tempered on the anvil of this peninsula for thousands of years. So today, take another look at the map. The Korean Peninsula. It looks tiny. It looks precarious. Surrounded by superpowers on all sides. A nuclear-armed state to the north, sitting right on top of a war that still hasn't technically ended. But this exact piece of land is what made the entire world listen to our music and binge our dramas today. Our semiconductors are literally acting as the brains of modern global civilization. Our food is landing on dinner tables across the planet. The peninsula is moving the world. That is the power of geography, and that is our power.